Thank you for coming inside on such a gorgeous afternoon. He began his career as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, where he was involved with the implementation of a community-based marine protected area. Marine protected areas are a theme that that runs throughout Patrick's work. Following his time in the Peace Corps as a graduate student and a Fulbright scholar, Patrick worked on problems of environmental decision-making in Nicaragua, where he engaged indigenous fishing communities in participatory research that led to the development of a management plan for a large estuary. Sorry. Patrick came to the UW as a postdoc. He was a postdoc in Marine and Environmental Affairs. He now holds a joint appointment between the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs and the Jackson School of International Studies. His research concerns social ecological impacts of marine protected areas, social and institutional feasibility of marine ecosystem-based management, especially in developing countries, and Pacific Northwest tribal perspectives on marine resource and conservation. He continues to work on problems of integrated coastal management in the Philippines and recently led a major investigation focused on the Coral Triangle, and you're going to hear more about that today. Closer to home, Patrick works on coastal management issues within Puget Sound, and he's provided a fair amount of advice to the Puget Sound Partnership on aspects of their work. The theme that runs throughout Patrick's work is the governance of marine protected areas. He works at scales from the very small and local all the way to global scales of marine management. Patrick's received a number of really prestigious awards, especially in 2007. He was awarded a Pew Fellowship. He serves as the editor-in-chief of Coastal Management Journal, and he has been widely recognized here and abroad for his integration of social science and applied ecological theory, especially with regard to conservation and management. Patrick obtained his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, an MS and a PhD degree from the University of Michigan, and we are very fortunate to have him as a faculty member in our department. So join me in welcoming Patrick.
Thank you very much. So that was very generous, Terry. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to start out, of course, by thanking the organizers of the Bevan series. It's really generous to have a chance to come speak with you. So thank you so much, Brooke and Daniel. I also would thank you all for coming today on such a beautiful day. It's really hard to go head-to-head on a beautiful day in January. But and thank you very much, Terry, for the generous introduction. Terry talked a little bit about my background, but one of the things I want to just remind people in the audience is that I come to marine protected areas and marine reserves as a person who studies them, but also who's been involved in their implementation. And so I know the complexities of doing this kind of work. I tried to occupy the space of not being overly acting as a proponent or an advocate of them, although I do believe they have their rightful place as a management tool. But I also believe as a scholar that some of the best things that I can do is to ask challenging questions and to ask questions that might provoke sometimes an unpopular response, but that are important to deal with. So today I'm going to be talking about addressing why marine reserves fail, and also I'm going to try to be a bit provocative about challenging some of the precepts around marine conservation planning. So many talks in our field and papers in this field talk about the crisis of the oceans, right? The last talk last week started out that way. It's a very common approach to our scholarship. As an applied social scientist, and actually my first two degrees were in natural science, so I have this kind of odd training. But I'm always wondering, the question that comes to my mind when I see the word crisis is, I say, it's a crisis about what and for whom? because frequently we'll read papers like this, Pandolfi's paper in Science about coral reefs. It's a system that I do a lot of work on. This is a well-known paper in the journal Science, where he basically plots out the reefs of the world from a system that's pristine to one that's ecologically extinct. He scares us to death by suggesting that reefs might go ecologically extinct within 50 years. Take-home message, of course, is that no reefs on the planet are pristine ecologically. It's not clear, what his recommendations for policies. He recommends protected areas, but he doesn't go into the questions about, well, how would those recommendations land on people? Who are the winners and losers? Rather, it's just, here's the solution to this really tragic problem of the crisis of the reefs of the planet. One of the things that I was exposed to as a Peace Corps volunteer was cyanide fishing for the aquarium fish trade. So perhaps you've seen slides like this before. But when I think about the question of crisis, one could say this is a crisis of coral reefs, of biodiversity. These reefs are being desecrated with the use of sodium cyanide. But if you look beyond just the scope of the individual squirting the cyanide on the reef, which is frequently where our analysis ceases or stops, and you look at it from a global perspective, you might learn that this is a global market where tens of millions of organisms are being traded annually, the vast majority of which die in transport to the United States and Europe. But it's also a crisis for these fishers because many of them are diving with compressed air. They suffer the bends. There's tremendous health issues associated with the collection of aquarium fish, for example. And maybe it's even a crisis for the consumer because it's difficult frequently to source sustainable fish. So the question here is, are we only going to talk about the crisis of the reef, or are we going to talk about a crisis of a globalized fishery? And a fishery and policies that don't take into consideration human well-being, for example, and sustainability of the trade. One of the, we talk a lot about the crisis of Puget Sound. But frequently, and this is a bit provocative, we fail to acknowledge the fact that there are haves and have-nots in our planet. We might problematize or be concerned about these Indonesian fishers who are extracting a lot of things from the marine world. We might say that they're over-exploiting the resources, they're extracting too much. But people in South Puget Sound with a multi-million-dollar home, that tends not to be in the front pages of the policy dialogue about the futures of the ocean. It would take this woman gathering urchins in the Philippines 1,200 years to gain enough money to buy that house. So personally, I think that there also should be in the marine conservation discourse an acknowledgement that there's a crisis of inequity and that our policies have to deal with the fact that this is very relevant to policies because policies are social constructs. Fisheries are social constructs. MPAs are social constructs. They land on a social milieu that this difference in wealth in the planet is very apparent to people around the planet. So we have to acknowledge this. So while Elliot may have said, I don't care who's responsible for the desecration of the oceans, we certainly have to be very aware of how the policies are going to land on different social groups and how they will affect different social groups. And I say that both for ethical reasons, but also for very practical reasons in terms of the success of marine conservation. So again, to remind us, I mean, we frame the issue as a crisis. I tend to frame it broadly, that it's not only an ecological crisis, but it's also a crisis that has socioeconomic and cultural dimensions, that the drivers are not only local, but they're global. Policies need to consider the social and ecological context on many levels. Otherwise, our policies may have the exact opposite consequences of what we hope for. People may reject them, the situation may get worse, etc. Now, one of the things that's interesting in the world of marine protected areas is that we spend decades debating whether this happens, spillover. I was asked to review a paper in a review paper in a European journal, 90% of the journal articles on MPAs were ecological in nature, most of them debating whether there was spillover of adult, larval fishes, for example. And I'm not anti-science, but I think personally, having swam on reefs where there was no MPA one day, and then 3 years later I almost got bit by sharks and there were large groupers swimming in them, it's not rocket science. You don't fish for the fish, they get larger and they produce more offspring. Now, there may be complexities around networks and design and size, et cetera, and those are interesting. I'm not trying to say that science should have been done. But what was also notable to me was the social dimensions of marine preserves and marine protected areas was completely absent. It's changing. You know, silly slide by our friend Gary, but the reality is that, you know, there's interesting dynamics around marine protection. For example, the idea came from land and was exported to the ocean. We struggle with wording. Is it a preserve? Is it a reserve? Is it a protected area? Is it no take? What is it? There's also interesting social dynamics of hapless tourists driving around or swimming around. And why are they there? Well, they're there to observe. They're there to spend their money. All these kinds of things are fascinating for people like me and hopefully for you. Now, the good news is that the amount of scholarship around human dimensions of marine protected areas is exploding. So if you're interested in this field, this is the time to get on with it, because there's a burgeoning literature around it. There's increased interest in funding this kind of scholarship. Some of these people like Josh Sinner, like Gutierrez, who was from here, has published interesting papers, but Mike Masha, Richard Polnack, Alan White, and the like. So there's a really growing literature that I would encourage you to engage in, and this talk is going to actually grow from that literature. So I'm going to be looking at marine protected areas today in sort of 4 case studies, very common sort of social sciencey approach case studies, right? I'll be talking about a large scale with these so-called large marine reserves, an area in the Coral Triangle initiative. I'll be talking about the Philippines, where I've both been a practitioner as well as a scholar. And then I'll be talking about some work I've done recently in Puget Sound around marine protected areas. And the kind of themes that I'm going to be engaging and looking at when I look at case studies, I'm interested in things like, what are the goals of these places? What's the planning process utilized? What's the governance system that's in placed in? What's the focus on capacity development of institutions and people? What's the role of science and other knowledge forms? And then what's the role and the reliance and the dependence on external actors, for example? So these are kinds of things that I'm interested in. So when we look at marine reserves, especially large marine reserves, there was the CBD, Convention for Biological Diversity, targeted of 20% of the oceans by 2020 and no-take reserves. Well, the ante's now been upped. As of the Sydney meeting in the Congress for the protected areas, where they're now apparently consensus that we need 30% of the oceans in no-take reserves. So again, interesting time to be involved in studying marine protected areas. If you don't get marine MPA news, I'd really encourage you to get in contact and get on this mailing list. It doesn't cost you anything. Very interesting resource out of the University of Washington, or a link to it. So I'm going to talk about these so-called mega reserves or large marine reserves. Pew Charitable Trust has a program called GOL, Global Ocean Legacies Program. It's one of their campaigns. It operates in these large protected areas. These blue areas, red areas, these are some of their campaign areas. I'm going to be, these are very large areas. I'm going to be talking about this one a little bit, Chagos in the Indian Ocean, which is an interesting case within the GOL program. Here's a screen grab from their website. They've also worked, one of their flagships was in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. But they have a number of places that they're working. This is a multi-million-dollar initiative to work simultaneously in these large reserves, primarily initially in not heavily populated areas, but increasingly, because the low fruit has been picked, they're going to be having to work in more populated areas. So hence the kind of work that I and maybe you do will become more relevant. But also most of these areas, Pew insists that they mostly be no-take areas. That's really important to them. Chagos. A very controversial one in the Indian Ocean. Storyline goes something like this. You have strong advocates for it and certain people who are very critical of the Chagos Marine Reserve. I don't know a lot of details. I haven't done research in this place, but the literature basically says the story is something like this area was depopulated, a military reserve was set up, the Americans use it as a military reserve. Recently, it was declared by the UK government as the largest MPA at the time. It's no longer. No-take area. Some people are saying this is really interesting, and the Chagosians have filed in UK court to be able to come back to their homelands, and they're being told, no, you can't. And some people are questioning whether the Marine Reserve was essentially kind of, part of that, trying to derail their repatriation requests. Other people say, no, 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 it's mostly about the biodiversity. Don't make this a geopolitical issue. And let's keep these two things separate. Biodiversity conservation, these are definitely pristine areas, but let's not mix geopolitics and environmental justice issue or justice issues with our environmentalism. That doesn't have to happen. Whereas other people are saying, well, but you know what? This sounds a little fishy, and maybe even colonialism to some degree. So I'm not going to take sides in this debate. I'm just going to say that there is a raging debate about some of these large reserves, and it's important that we all acknowledge that. Personally, I think it's intellectually dishonest not to acknowledge the fact that these areas are conflicted. And that's an interesting phenomenon to study. The other thing that's very interesting as well is if you go out in the Google sphere and Google the words ocean grab. This is a term that's emerging now, primarily in reference to the grabbing of the oceans for large mining, deep sea mining, or large-scale commercial fisheries. But what's also very interesting about this term is that it's now being applied to marine protected areas. And people are saying that proponents of these mega reserves are engaging, like mining, in an ocean grab. And they're basically setting aside areas without much concern for the effects on vulnerable people. Now, again, I leave it to you to make a decision. It's also interesting to me that conservationists are being categorized along with deep sea mining interests. But in some people's minds, those are not that dissimilar. It's about taking control of space. I encourage you to read Steinberg's Social Construction of the Oceans if you're interested in some of this analysis. Now, part of the story as well is the story of emergent learning networks. I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working with Alani Wilhelm, who's a Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian woman. She is leading a group of people that's engaging in discussion around the management of these large reserves. And this is a reserve system that overlaps many of the Pew sites. And some of these are proposed, and some of them are by NGOs, some of them are governments. But these are very large areas of no-take area within the big ocean system. What's interesting about big ocean is that it's a learning network of managers who effectively are at the forefront of these debates and in the practical issues of managing these large reserves. So they're the ones holding the bag when Chagos blows up in their face. So what they're doing is coming together through face-to-face meetings, through online dialogue, through exchanges between different sites to learn from one another, how do we deal with the complexities of the management of these large reserves? They're active in developing publications about the kinds of science that help them, their viewpoints about these things, and guidelines for improving the management of these large reserves. So these are people that don't deny that these areas are fraught, that they sometimes are implemented better than others, but they're also people who want to see these exist, and they want to improve their management. And I'm gonna, okay, I didn't plug in told myself I was gonna plug in the video or the sound on this thing, and I didn't do that. I think I'll probably just forego that because I don't know if it'll be loud enough. I don't see the audio output here. Sorry? Oh, that's right. Okay, thank you. Smarter than me. So this is a site. This is in the French Polynesia part of the South Seas, and this is a emergent large protected area. And the story of this area is that it's large, 700,000 square kilometers. The project was initiated in 2013. The creation of this large reserve is expected in 2015. What's interesting about the background is the French government had wanted to just declare this area. Elliot talked about the signing of the monument in Northwest Hawaiian Islands through the Antiquities Act. And recently, President Obama declared the Pacific Remote Islands one. Well, the French government wanted to do something similar to that here. And the Marquesans, as well as the French representative here, said, that might not work very well. This is a place where people live. And so they developed this video here that I'd like to play for you. And I want you to think about, how do people talk about the oceans?
It was an encounter between the ocean and the sky.
It's not coming through.
That gave birth to my
Oh, it is?
home.
Hopefully you can hear it. What's that? It's all right. Okay, well maybe, let me, hopefully people can hear. Maybe it's pretty loud video, so hopefully you'll be able to hear here. And what I want you to think about is, how do people talk about the ocean and some of the processes that they're using with this large protected area.
Father used to tell me, it is this same ocean, crisscrossed time and again by our tupuna in their double-hulled canoes, that is the source of our life. It feeds us, it cares for us, it is the connecting force between all Polynesians. We are the children of the ocean. What the ocean offers us is confirmed by the scientific community, an incredibly rich biodiversity where an abundance of plankton attracts a great number of manta rays, hammerhead sharks, marine mammals, and endemic species. Extraordinary traditional knowledge is passed down from generation to generation through the customs of fishing and eating, as well as storytelling. Unfortunately, this ocean surrounding us is suffering. Climate change, overfishing, mining, pollution, the life cycles are deeply disturbed. This is why, conscious of the fragility of our natural and cultural heritage, in the face of these global problems, we, demarcations, children of the ocean, have decided to work together towards an innovative and sustainable future. Local people, scientists, and politicians are collaborating to find tomorrow's solutions. We too, school children of the Marquesas, are contributing to the momentum by creating the first educational managed marine area in the world. Thus, all together, old and young, fishermen and scientists, children and our public servants, we are designing our own future by creating a large-scale protected marine area for the Marquesas. My name is Uwenui. I am 13 years old. I am Marquesian, and I am a child of the ocean.
So I hope people were people able to hear that? Good. Macintosh comes through. Powerful speakers. So what so what do we hear in that message? Are people connected with the ocean? Yes. People are children of the ocean. Are people willing to engage in discussion about large-scale marine protected areas? Yes. But they want to do it in a way that's culturally relevant and not antagonistic to them. They want to think about it engaging lots of people in a planning process and different ages. They want to engage scientists, but it has to be in a process that they're comfortable with. So for me, in terms of large protected areas, I worry, to put it starkly, that international advocacy coalitions are leading to large marine reserve declarations. It's possible and even likely that there will be growing resistance to these unless the planning process is altered. And I believe organizations and learning networks like Big Ocean and others can actually play a very positive role in ensuring that this is done properly. Perhaps even Big Ocean may not be reliant on GLORIS or GOL, and maybe managers and people of these places without support from Westerners and Northerners will be declaring new reserves on their own. I think that would be an interesting outcome. The next case I'm going to talk about is the CTI. Now, the Coral Triangle is the most biologically diverse system, marine system on the planet. It's a place where lots of people live. It is a place where approximately 30 to 50% of people's animal protein comes from the ocean, so they're very reliant on this area. The Coral Triangle was demarcated, and then the Coral Triangle Initiative was launched about 6 years or 7 years ago. 6 countries coming together, Asian and Melanesian countries, to preserve this area. And the US taxpayer and other sources of funding came to bear tens of millions of dollars, arguably the most ambitious conservation effort ever taken on, involving in fisheries management, climate change planning, and marine protected area implementation. I had the great honor of being asked to come in the 5th year to evaluate the implications of this initiative and how well it had worked. I led a team with Richard Polnack of about 25 researchers. We did over 2,000 interviews in 6 countries, and here are some initial results. One thing we focused on was the implementation of marine protected areas. And this is a very exciting initiative. There's now a Coral Triangle MPA system that consists of over 1,900 marine protected areas in these 6 countries. Alan White from the Nature Conservancy is a good contact if you want to talk more about this with somebody who's very knowledgeable about it. It's a very ambitious endeavor involving these 6 countries. They're developing guidebooks for the implementation. They're publishing in journals like Coastal Management, the journal that I edit, about this, so you can look about more details there in these journal articles. One of the things that's notable about this system of MPAs in these 6 countries is that they have so-called flagships. These are nominated by the countries themselves as learning places about MPAs. These are not perfectly implemented MPAs. Some of them are not perfectly enforced, but they're attempts at MPA implementation. And so each country has now come forward and declared these so-called flagship sites. One of the things, of course, that I find really fascinating and doesn't surprise me at all is the really balanced approach that the CTI has used in choosing sites, implementing sites, evaluating sites. They not only consider the ecological, but also governance concerns as well as social concerns. And it's very balanced. One of the things that we did was conduct what's called a social network analysis. And I'm going to thank Deanna Petrie and Melissa Luna and others in this endeavor. We conducted an online survey of practitioners. And these are practitioners in these 6 countries who had regularly participated in a learning network referred to as the RECs, the regional exchanges. And in the CTI initiative, they brought people together on certain topics face-to-face on a regular basis, paid for by US taxpayers through USAID. And then they would go back to their countries and continue the dialogue and talk about how they could implement MPAs, climate change planning, et cetera. We asked people on an online survey to nominate, to tell us, who are the 10 people that, up to 10 people that you regularly communicate with about MPA implementation and CTI issues. We then import that matrix of information into UCINet, a software program, and each one of these dots is a person. Think of this as a communication food web. The dots get larger when there's more inward nominations. That person has higher prestige in social network ease. So what we see here is certain people, these are all the countries coded by colors. US is here, this is the Solomons, and I'm going to talk in particular about this individual here and this individual here. First, this individual here. This is an interdisciplinary scientist from the US, the most prestigious person in this social network. He's been working in the region for over 30 years, has a lot of face time in Asia. And one of the things that's really interesting about this individual is that we asked people, why do you work with this person? And they said lots of things, like he has technical knowledge. Now keep in mind he's interdisciplinary. He's both a natural scientist and a social scientist, so that's very important to people. But he's also an avenue to connections to other people, and they feel that he's trustworthy, and he's also their friend. But there's a lot of reasons that people communicate with people. Now I'm going to talk about the second individual, which is this person from the Solomon Islands. And it's not common practice to read long quotes in Bevan's talks, but I'm going to do this because I'm a social scientist and I can. So this is an interview with this woman from the Solomon Islands. And keep in mind that this is one of the most sexist, or this is a place that's difficult to be a woman frequently. This is Melanesia. It frequently is dangerous to be a woman in the villages. But it's also a place where women haven't had a lot of agency within the government. I'm inspired by women in this forum. I've learned a lot. Like, women can play a great role in leadership. I come from a background where women are not so much considered. We talk marine science. This forum also influences the perspectives of the male in society. For us in the Solomons, they will always laugh at us because they all say, we'll run the logistics. But at the end of the day, we'll be there debating on issues of national importance, about marine and coastal resource management. My mentor is Director Lynette and Jessica from the Philippine government. I exchange emails on a daily basis with them every time they encourage women like themselves. I think it's profound because it also talks about how marine conservation and resource management initiatives are like this can change civil society, can empower individuals, can create mentorship relationships between women across historically divided cultures, Asia and Melanesia, communication challenges there. They're talking about technical issues. And if you think that these things all kind of feel good, take into consideration this. When we surveyed national government people who don't have a vested interest in fact, many of these people were naysayers about MPAs, they would say that, yes, enforcement of MPAs is markedly improving because of such efforts, particularly focus on capacity development and what people have been learning in these networks. So the take-home message for me is process matters, investment in capacity development matters, and it results in tangible improvements in things that frequently are written about MPAs. People talk about enforcement and paper parks and all that. Well, there's also the positive side of this. And there's ways that you can use this kind of work to improve our management. So the take-home message for me on this case study is social capital can lead to a multinational MPA system and successful on-the-ground outcomes. So we've gone from global to regional. Let's go down to national, to the Philippines. Now, the Philippines has been written about a lot with regard to MPAs. It's well known for its work on community-based MPAs. If you know the work of Gary Russ and Angel Alcala and other people, they focused on this a lot. We now have over 1,000, or Philippines has over 1,000 community-based MPAs. These are declared by communities. They decide where they go. They enforce them. They monitor them, sometimes biophysical monitoring. It's a very bottom-up process. The governance in the Philippines allows it because communities and the mayors have jurisdiction out to 15 kilometers offshore. They don't even need approval from the national government. Most decentralized system of governance in the planet with oceans. Now, these are frequently small areas, commonly 10 to 20 hectares in size, sometimes up to 100 hectares, no-take areas. But Russ and others have shown that in Sumilan and Apo, there's been improvement in biomass over time. There's also been improvement, or at least maintenance, of annual catch levels. So what's interesting here is that you can have biophysical improvements as a result of these community-based processes. And Terry mentioned that I had received one of these so-called Pew Fellowships, and that was an honor. And I used those funds to study 2 nascent MPA networks in the central part of the Philippines, in Bohol and in Cebu. We did research in 36 MPAs. And these are impoverished areas. This is where people live. No fresh water. They live completely up from the ocean. People moved there because of the Second World War. Now, if we look at an important variable with our social surveys about things that you might care about, like are the fish increasing outside of the sanctuary, we have biophysical data, but I think it's interesting to present the social data here. The dependent variable here being, do fishermen, and these are based on about 300 surveys in 33 sites, and we ask a series of questions in these survey instruments, literally dozens of questions, and we ask them, do you think that fish are going up or down outside of these areas? Use a Likert scale to measure this and use the statistics. This is the output from a regression analysis. Which variables predict the variance in this dependent variable? And what we see here is that these 3 variables, clear leadership for the MPA, community enforcement strength, and the threat of commercial fishing, which is maybe counterintuitive, but it's sociology 101. When people feel threatened, they're willing to take such drastic actions like setting up an MPA, and they feel jealous of them. These are all statistically significant. These are the main predictors of this. And I want to focus on this one in particular, clear leadership. Here's another social network diagram from a successful MPA in the Philippines, one of those sites. And what you see here, each dot is a person in this community. And what you see here is a lot of pattern. There are leaders, there are proponents. These people have constituencies in the community. What's interesting from the point of the practitioner of the MPA is, aren't these the kind of people you want to be working with? So you can use social science as a way of identifying opportunities, but also this was independently collected data. It completely validates the survey data, which was then validated by the qualitative interviews that we did as well. It's very clear that leadership matters. So take-home message here is participatory planning can lead to a proliferation of community-based MPAs. And maybe you're not that concerned about issues around empowerment and those kinds of things. Maybe you really do care mainly about the fish. But I would maintain that in places like the Philippines, unless you pay attention to the human dimensions thing, the fish are going to disappear. There's no question. The last story is the Puget Sound area. And I've been doing some of this work with support from Sea Grant, from the Puget Sound Partnership. We've done surveys in 2 different years, collected hundreds of social surveys in dozens of MPAs. In the context of Puget Sound, you have about 110 officially designated marine protected areas. Not so many no-take areas. Most of the no-take areas are quite small. And I'm going to reduce this case study to something quite simplistic, because I wanted the headlines for me are about the planning process and inclusion of people that have both very strong rights, the Salish people of Puget Sound, who with the Bolt decision have very strong rights to fishing in usual and custom areas, but also frequently feel marginalized from the planning processes. So much to the degree that in 2003, they made a statement through the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission saying, we will not support the declaration of any more no-take areas in our usual and custom fishing areas. They have to be very strongly scientifically justified, and we have to be at the planning table. Otherwise, we will resist these. Now, what they're saying is we're not anti-MPA, but we need to be involved, and our rights need to be respected. If you're interested in this, you can read Sarah Singleton's work in the Journal of Coastal Management. Know the social network analysis here, but this is of a different breed. This is of you all, scientists. I was asked by the Puget Sound Partnership to do a social network analysis of people working in the Nearshore, scientists that work in the Nearshore of Puget Sound. Similar diagram. Dots get bigger when there's more inward nominations. We use an online survey. Who do you work with in your science in Puget Sound? These are coded by discipline, natural, social science, and interdisciplinary people. I'd like to thank Kristen Holton, who's now a doctoral student in Colorado State with some of this collaboration, and Beth Moore, a master's student at Marine Affairs. What's the take-home message here? Who's doing the research? Mostly natural scientists. 60% of the individuals here self-report as ecologists, 48% are biologists, 38% are fishery scientists. There's some social scientists up here in the corner talking to themselves. It's a highly articulated network of scientists. And actually talking about articulation, if you look at two realms and themes of research, salmon versus environmental perceptions, these are subnetworks. And what we see here is a very articulated subnetwork, lots of collaboration, lots of sharing. And here on human dimensions topics, a pretty disarticulated network. The partnership had asked me to look at these kinds of phenomena because they're a bit concerned that their investment in research is not returning on improved policymaking. And they think that they need to be thinking about the kind of science that is funded. They're not going to defund all you well-funded ecologists, but they are going to maybe think about how can you bring this to like this, for example, which I think is an interesting endeavor. If you're interested in this issue, again, please read this article. Now, I don't mean to be too harsh about MPAs in Puget Sound. There are a lot of people doing the best that they can given a difficult situation. But when we look to California or Oregon, the take-home message for me is that we're at a we're stalling out here around marine protected areas in Puget Sound. And I don't want to be perceived as a proponent of them because I think from a tribal point of view, it is very important that their rights are respected and that planning processes are equitable. So for me, the take-home message here is that the lack of an inclusive and interdisciplinary planning process has resulted in conflict, and we've lost opportunities to work with key allies. The tribes, in fact, could ultimately be an ally in this. But the process has to be right. And so that gets me to sort of the last parts of my talk here, which has to do with some reflections on the bigger picture of marine conservation and, in fact, science. So I'm going to say some challenging things here, maybe. I presented this at WSN recently with Mike Soule and Peter Kariva, and some people's noses got a little bent out of shape, but that's okay. I think, as Daniel will say, sometimes it's good to be provocative and engage, and also I engage you in pushing back on some of these ideas. So the dark side of marine conservation. So I was thinking about the term that's emerging, the Anthropocene. People are talking about the human-dominated planet. And I was thinking, okay, that's interesting. But and this is as a person who, to some degree, is a self-described environmentalist and a scientist. I personally think one of the interesting terms that we might want to consider using is the Misanthropocene. You know, misanthropy is defined as a pessimistic distrust of human behavior. And I think some of the components of this is that there's a very narrow framing that prefers to isolate environmental issues from issues of environmental justice. There's issues around, and I'll call it what I think it is, natural science worship. The idea that natural science is primary in defining what the crisis is and what the solutions ought to be. I mean, personally, I think it's important that the ecology is done, but I also think that the applied social sciences and maybe even some humanities work should be done as well. There should be a place for women's studies majors in saving the oceans. And I even said crazy things like at the International Coral Reef Symposium that I think that going forward, half of the research budgets for the ocean should be spent on applied social sciences. Big groan in the audience. Actually, maybe it should be more because social sciences has to catch up to natural science. Also, I do think that we focus a little bit too much on short-term victories, and this has to do with participatory planning. We were so intense on getting the win and meeting the deliverable that we forget about the process, and we may, in the long term, alienate our allies. And I think that sometimes and this is not my terms, these are terms in the literature, these are terms that come from informants, the thousands and thousands of people I've interviewed in 20 years. They're basically saying they're concerned that conservation as practiced in the developing world and sometimes even the developed world smells and feels a little bit like being colonized. And that doesn't feel so good, and I think that should be examined. Now, because I was so impressed with this notion about tracking terms that Elliot was doing and things like that, I tracked Anthropocene, very popular. I'm encouraging us to tweet out this new word, Misanthropocene. So Trevor, Max, get on it. I want to see this in the world. I knew it would be, man. I sat next to that guy last time, man. He's a busy guy. So social engineering, you know. And I want to be constructive here. I want to talk about what I think is important is a constructive science in this Anthropocene. So what's constructive? It's serving a useful purpose. It's building up. So first of all, I'd like to think about a science that's context appropriate, framing issues in a diverse way that's meaningful in the context. I do believe it needs to be interdisciplinary. It doesn't mean that everyone is an interdisciplinist, but maybe creating teams where there's balance and mutual understanding and collaboration. We're committed to places for the long term, the Gary Russes, the Alan Whites of the world that work for decades in the same place and they build trust. It's service-oriented and participative. We can do our science, we can extract information, we can publish our papers, but maybe we should be thinking about other modes of collecting data and making sense of the world, and maybe asking people what are the right questions to be asking and fostering that kind of thing. I think we also should be really careful about including various kinds of knowledge. Science is one way of generating knowledge. The scientific method is one way. It was very clearly pointed out by Bob Johannes that Palauan fishermen had a tremendous traditional ecological knowledge about the biology of reefs in Palau that far exceeded marine biological understanding of those same reefs. That's reality. That's empirically grounded. Traditional people and local people have really important information that we should be engaging and utilizing and respecting. Rather than talking about truths, I would like to talk about flipping concepts. So in conservation, I'd like to talk about maybe turning conservation on its head a little bit and talk about maybe, I talked about constructive science. I'd like us to consider about that and how we practice our science. The role of the outsider. I think that the outsider should be there to facilitate, to build capacity, and in a sense, the old adage in Peace Corps, work yourself out of a job. Get out of the way. Be constructive, provide information when it's invited, and work in partnership. The goals of MPAs, most certainly, in my opinion, should be social-cultural, and they should be as important as ecological and economic, because you notice from the Marquesan video, they're talking about huge protected area, but it's really important for them as an educational protected area. Did you hear that? They said this is going to be the first educational protected area. That terminology is loaded, and it's meaningful. One thing we also have to be, and Daniel and I were chatting about this in the seminar today, I actually think that we need to be focused on the process with multiple possible outcomes. Because when we decide that the outcome is like this, we're just using participation in an instrumentalist way. We're just trying to lead people by their noses to get to the conclusion that we already had. That's neither respectful, nor, in fact, is it very effective in most instances. People know that, and they want to be engaged in a meaningful way, and that means you have to be flexible. So you might get to the same end with sustainability of the oceans through protected areas, or it might be marine spatial planning, or it might be fisheries management, or it might be traditional practices. We don't really know. We should be curious. I think we should be focused on building a broad constituency base with special attention to active participation of the most vulnerable. Because we can't afford for our policies to more marginalize the people who are already marginalized. That will blow up in our faces. Almost done here. So I'm also going to ask us to think about another term. Maybe I'm not trying to be promoting here, but I was thinking about what would be a term that I'd be comfortable with conservation. I was thinking humanistic conservation. Humanism is a philosophy and values that reflect a belief in human dignity and science. Came out of the humanistic movement, of course. And This is some attributes of what I think humanistic conservation might look like. You have supportive donors that work for the long term in areas, or maybe it's self-financed, because there's a weird power dynamic when millions of dollars flow into a place. And then when that money goes away, things collapse, or they get to call the shots. There's also, I believe it should be socio-ecologically science-based, and that should play a role in the monitoring, long-term monitoring of areas. I think it should be participatory and transparent, that decisions shouldn't happen behind closed doors between certain individuals, even if that's legal. There should be local process facilitators who are very skilled at this. I work in the Philippines. Community organizers are wonderful at this kind of work. We should be using learning networks as a useful tool to engender buy-in as well as learning. And I think social movements behind conservation should be the goal. You know, what groups like 350.org are trying to do around climate, creating a social movement. I don't think we're going to get any movement on climate change until there's a social movement that demands policy change. And I also think that we should be thinking about multiple possible management tools and frameworks. We tend to kind of fetishize certain tools, like the MPA, like EBM, like MSP. Enough already, you know? And the fact of the matter is that there's so much overlap between the concepts anyway. What we need to be thinking about is good process in any of those things. So I personally think that if we invest in this and many other things, we could, this would lead to large MPAs, if that's our goal or the people's goal. It can be context appropriate, and it can improve the chance for social and ecological success and sustainability. I'd like to thank Heather Tallis and Jane Luchenko and others for putting this manifesto out there in the journal Nature, and some of you signed on to it. I would encourage you to read it because I think this is very much in line with what I'm kind of saying. And one of the things that's kind of weird to me is why people get all uptight when you when you kind of present these kinds of things, and why there's resistance. And I would like to just explore a little bit. I mentioned in my outline, in my abstract, that I would explore this a little bit. I think there's some resistance, for one, because there's some anxiety about the future of the ocean and humanity. So people are anxious. And the old model of conservation, to some degree, works. And it's what's familiar. So people don't want to be trying lots of new things, and things like this might feel a little risky. I also would say that I think there are vested interests in the old model. Careers are built around them. Funding portfolios are built around them. One thing that's interesting to me in terms of science and the primacy of natural science, it's a tenet of conservation. When the Nature Conservancy says we're a science-based organization, or this MPA is science-based, they're not using science in the sense of social science and natural science. It's primarily natural science. It's code for natural science. Now, that's changing a little bit, and it's even written into our laws, although Magnus and Stevens, NOAA got in a lot of trouble by not having social science as part of their evaluations. I personally think there's a lot to be learned, and we can use some practice in how we frame environmental issues and opening up the tent. I also think that there's some discomfort with going forward with a more humanistic approach to conservation because it's about loss of control. And people like to feel in control. They like to think that A leads to B leads to C. This doesn't work like that. You don't know in a participatory process ultimately where you're leading, where you're going. So I think that we have a desire for very predictable outcomes. So I'm going to ask the tweeters of the planet to undo this problem, and when I search for humanistic conservation, I don't get any hits yet. So I'm asking you guys to resolve that, and this is my final suggestion, my last slide for today. So thank you very much. I personally think a solution is trusting humanity helps save the ocean and her people. And with that, I would love to have some questions and discussion. Thanks. Yeah? Yes, of course. Hey, guys. Hi. Any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Bo. I have a question about participation in conservation. It's often compared as a dual property, a bit like the
Mm-hmm.
where you want to get to.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate as to why getting to participation in itself is also
Right.
one of the goals.
So one of the main proponents, okay, yeah, can I get away from things? One of the main proponents of Miles Horton is a really interesting guy. He worked with the labor movement in the Southeast. He talked a book with Paulo Freire, a Brazilian intellectual, pedagogist, very influential man in the world of participatory research. And they spoke a book in something called the Highlander Center in Tennessee. It's an organization that focuses on participatory research. And the title of the book was, "You Make the Road by Walking It." Now the notion here is this, is that you're right. Participation, you don't want it to be just participation for participation's sake. That's frustrating. But, and I'm looking at Daniel because he was articulating that at the seminar earlier today, but also, so you want there to be an outcome. And I personally believe that it's empirically shown. If you look at Gutierrez's review paper, if you look at other meta-analyses, participation and co-management is essential to effective fisheries management and ocean governance. And I don't care if you live in the US or Canada or the developing world, it matters. People want to be respected and engaged. And there will not be a social contract between them and the rules if they feel like they're unfair and they weren't asked their opinion. And it's hard to enforce people at the high seas or in the oceans and force things. So there's a goal, and participation can even be used sometimes in an instrumentalist way, which I think is sometimes a bit problematic because it gives the sense that people are really being respected. But ultimately, you already knew what the outcome is that you wanted. That's sometimes a bit worrisome and is critiqued in the social sciences. But agreeing with what you're saying as well, the very mechanism, the walking the road, is really important because things like the Woman from the Solomons come out. You know, that's about marine resource management, but it's about civil society and gender equality. And it affects society in a really different way than just getting the MPA in the water. So I think it's both important to have outcomes, but the process matters. And, you know, I also believe fervently that it depends, participation in different contexts matters. And it's not possible to say, this is the first step, the second step, the third step in all contexts. It's contextually and culturally embedded. So you have to be very careful about context. Trevor. Yep. Sure.
And displaced huge amounts of people, never really compensated.
Right.
And now I'm looking there in 2014, thinking, well, nowhere else is there any wildlife left.
Mm-hmm.
That place that was chopped down.
Right.
So it's hard to say what the right solution is. Clearly, a lot of people are wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, and Yellowstone is another good example. That's rolled out as an unqualified success. But if you talk to a Native American that had been living in Yellowstone 100 years ago and people described it as a depopulated landscape, that's far from the truth. People were moved forcibly. Now, I also don't think Yellowstone or Kruger should be de-gazetted, personally. I don't think that would be a success. But the reality is that a couple things. One, we don't live in the world of 100 years ago. Thank goodness. We've learned a few things about justice. Colonialism has been critiqued, hopefully. And we now live in an Anthropocene. And so the reality is from a very practical point of view, we have no choice but to engage in a participatory planning process. Because the low fruits, the Northwest Hawaiian Islands of the world, maybe, but actually I think there was a lot of lost opportunities there. Because when it became a monument, that closed certain doors or made certain doors more difficult to pass through, like the cultural meaning of a monument is different than it is for a sanctuary, for example. So I agree with you that certainly top-down management can result in declaration of protected areas. I do believe that in today's world that's going to be increasingly more challenging, especially in populated places of the world. And many ocean places are like that, especially coastal areas. And so, I mean, that's my response. It's not to say those are horrible places or they should be gazetted. I just think that we need to be thinking of alternatives, and we need to be thinking about the positive way of engaging people in a goal-oriented participative planning process. Yeah, yeah, that would be the analogy. In the way in the back, please. Sorry, thanks.
I liked your analogy to colonialism. I noticed that all of your examples are places where rich Americans or Europeans have gone and found some power people and persuaded them somehow to give up their fish so that they could do better existence breed. Can you say a little bit more about why these communities chose to engage in MPAs as a result of this participatory process? Did it go as
Right.
as
Sure. Yeah.
participatory process where they gave up their gold and their gods?
Well, I mean, I think the Philippines is a very good example of that. So, and it's a historically, it's an interesting history. So, during the colonial era of the Spanish Empire, they did away with all traditional management practices. It's very likely that the Philippines had taboo structures, had no-take areas. Palau's had no-take areas for thousands of years based on taboo. We did not invent the concept of MPAs. It's existed in the Pacific Islands for thousands of years. It co-evolved with cultures. In the Philippines, the first thing the colonists did was say that's backwards because they wanted access to the resources. The Americans came in the 20th century. They established the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resource Management. They used MSY. They did sustainable fisheries, all these kinds of things, and it worked fairly well, but it was very foreign, and it was very top-down. And Ferdinand Marcos was disposed by the People Power Revolution in 86. And one of the things that's really fascinating, Chris, is that when there was a change in the government, they went immediately to a very decentralized ocean governance system because it's an insular country over thousands of islands, and the oceans really matter to people, both in terms of food security and money and all kinds of things. And so now they have this very decentralized governance system. And there's guidance from the central government, like there's a fisheries law that says they should have protected areas, so they're encouraged to do that. But local municipalities are now in a state of competing for one another to declare no-take areas with local communities because it's seen as good politics, good practice. And part of the reason is because the formula has been changed because they're now in the driver's seat. Now, I'm not going to pretend that all those MPAs are successful or that there's not conflict around them. I have other papers that I published about some of the conflict. But local communities have ways of resolving this. So I think it has to do, to cut to the chase, Chris, it has to do with, some of it has to do with history, and it is possible for local people to, in fact, become proponents of MPAs. It gets back to the process. Who's in control and calling the shots, and how does science play into that, and how does governance play into that, and can people actually, and I actually personally think that in Puget Sound, for example, with some change in the formula and how relations are between different actors, we could really change things. Now, I'm not saying that MPAs have to be declared or should be declared, but right now, what's happening is not working. So I don't know if that got to a response, but so I think that it has to do with the social context and trying to work with that social context, and it'll depend. In a traditional Pacific Islander place, there's now the locally managed marine area network. Thousands of people across the Pacific are engaged in what they call a marine managed area. They don't call them MPAs because they don't like the idea of the P in the MPA, because they have cultural relationships with these places. And frequently, many of those marine managed areas have no-take areas, have taboo areas, and there's now a proliferation of these things throughout the Pacific Islands. But it's based on a communication process. Please.
In a more urban and modern society, in 1850s, why we had hunters and gatherers, and the hunters, fishermen, were probably important to the sustainability of both the settlers and the Native Americans in their community. Today, in 2015, most of the gatherers have become very important because they gather at Safeway and
Mm-hmm.
to preserve or to save fish,
Yeah.
animals, and others?
That's a good, very good question. And also you see this a lot in, say, the U.S. context, where effectively we've disengaged from participatory processes. We just assume that the NEPA process will deal. We might get invited to a stakeholder consultative meeting, but then we just kind of leave it to the agencies to make the decision. That's kind of how we organize. And part of that is kind of related to the phenomena you're talking about, which is that people going to the Safeway can't really be bothered by going to tons and tons of meetings. They're not that they don't have a strong connection with the ocean. They want those resources to be in the ocean. It's important to them. So I think you raise a really good question. I guess in response to that, look at the Great Barrier Reef. Modern society, really important resource. They wanted to go to a place where they had more areas and no-take areas. They started a very long, challenging, consultative process, science-based, using Marxan and models, but they used technology to create transparent planning of people that were not only fishermen or divers, but also Joe Schmo, who lives next to a massive area of reef. They had tens of thousands of public comments. They dealt with them in a very transparent way. And sure, reality is that most management practices upset everyone a little bit, or maybe a lot of it. There has to be sacrifice, and different constituencies and different social groups have to come. There has to be a clear process, a legal process in the developed world context. But I think the Great Barrier Reef was an interesting outcome, and ultimately they went from a small percentage to 33% of the area is no-take, and they tried to work on how that would be considered equitable and ecologically viable and important. So I think there are some examples out there. I think the Great Barrier Reef is a really good example. Please. Right. It's a very good question. So I was asked by the Packard Foundation to look at the phenomenon of what happens after donor money goes away in Philippines and Indonesia. And we did surveys in 9 sites, 7 in the Philippines, 2 in Indonesia. We did thousands of surveys, qualitative interviews, biophysical monitoring, economic assessments, big team effort. And one of the things that we found now Philippines and Indonesia are both Asian, but Philippines very bottom up, and in the time we did that work, Indonesia was still fairly top down. Law 22 had just passed, it's fairly centralized in Jakarta. And what you find in a lot of these kinds of projects is that certain variables are context independent. Like I would maintain that in most cases, transparency and participatory planning processes are very important in most contexts of the planet. Now, Cuba doesn't decide marine management in a very transparent way. Brunei doesn't either, and they have successful management. And maybe there are other places like in some Pacific islands, it's not very democratic in some islands. But many cases in the world post sort of the development of civil society and democratization, for example, participation really matters. And when you do the statistics, those independent variables explain a huge amount of the variance in dependent variables about things you matter, like effectively managed MPAs and the like. So, but then what you see is other variables like how you resolve conflicts is very context specific. So you need a mechanism by which you resolve conflict, but frequently how conflict is resolved is very context dependent. So you don't resolve it the same way in the US as you might in Nicaragua, like you might in the Philippines. So my response to you is this, is that some variables, and I would encourage you, I think some of the meta-analysis by like Gutierrez, but also Sinner, some of my work has looked in multiple contexts. Some of those variables I offer you, I think like leadership, participation, these are very important variables in many contexts. Other ones are very context specific, and then other ones are the interpretation of the process or how the process plays out is very context dependent as well. And that's actually where you have to rely on the Alan Whites of the world and the practitioners of the world to understand what does it mean to do, you know, conflict resolution in that country? And that's kind of like the art of management. Relying on those people who have lots of long-standing experience. Dan, you stood up, so that is.
One more question just before we get to it. There is another seminar in here at 6. It's the Program on Climate Change. It's doing an annual event, so they want to get us out of here. There's one more quick question.
Okay. I'm going to ask Nathan. He's going to ask me a tough one. This is a future collaborator of us at UW. Okay, Nathan, softball, underhand. Right. Well, some of the words were up there, but some of the words that come to my mind are humble, being service-oriented, being open-minded, being curious, and having an opinion, and using your scientific training to ask tough questions and good questions. I also don't think we should be apologetic. I hope that wasn't the take-home message that I think scientists should be apologetic. I think there's definitely a role for science, good old science with a capital S. But the question is when it comes to MPA planning, for example, and on-the-ground implementation, the scientists that I've seen that have been the most effective and impactful and happy are the ones that engage long-term in places, and they do, to some degree, by invitation. And they embed themselves in a process. They embed themselves in these learning networks. So I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't raise tough questions. They shouldn't shy away from publishing controversial things. That's the role of the scientist. But I do believe that, and what I found frequently is that many people, non-scientists, fishermen, really fisherwomen, really want us to engage in working with them. So they don't deny the importance of science. That's silly. It's a potent instrument. But they want it to be done in a way that's respectful and meaningful for them so that collectively we can go forward. So those are some of the things that come to my mind, Nathan.
Okay, so there is a reception for us out there, but there's also a reception for the PCC and the
Yeah, I was going to say. Free ridership.